'Tis fitting that a daughter of the race
whose chains are breaking,
should receive a gift
so rare as genius.
Mystery, scandal, sculpture, success, fame. It's really hard to read. Mary Edmonia Lewis was born free in upstate New York in 1844 and lived until 1907. Her father immigrated from Haiti, and her mother was American-born with African and Native American heritage. Lewis made her living and gained international fame as a sculptor. Most of her surviving works can be seen at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. Quotes from Lewis and descriptions of her exist from press articles and letters of her lifetime, but not much is known directly of her personality. Nevertheless, many scholars and authors have attempted to give Edmonia Lewis a voice of her own. So continuing that tradition, I, Rachel Urbanowitz, have teamed up with Stacey McCarter, who will be speaking as Edmonia Lewis today.
Miss Edmonia Lewis and I were wondering when it was going to be our turn.
Well, in a sense, this entire presentation is your turn, since it is 100% about Edmonia Lewis.
Really? But how different is that? For my lifetime of white people commenting on how I look and how I spoke before getting around to discussing my creations. Why don't you show another example of that?
Certainly. In this article about you, from a New York Times article in 1878, it says, "In person, she is rather below the medium stature and strong and supple rather than delicately made."
Of course I am strong. Have you ever chiseled a marble block?
No. But let's tell these folks a little about your early life.
Sadly, both my parents died by the time I turned 9. My older half-brother and I, Samuel is his name, we went to live with my mother Ojibwe sisters near Niagara Falls. We had a pretty good life of fishing and swimming and helping them make and sell craft items, Ojibwe craft items, like baskets and moccasins.
But at that time, you were not called Edmonia or Anne Samuel.
That's right. We were called by our Indian names. Samuel was sunshine and I was wildfire. I like that.
And Samuel, or Sunshine, was how much older than you?
9 years. He was very resourceful. He later became a barber, cutting hair out west for folks chasing the gold in the gold rush. He invested well and helped me through college.
Yes, in 1859, you started at Oberlin College in Ohio, where you changed your name
to Mary Edmonia Lewis. I like Mary because I'm a devout Catholic. In fact, later in my life, I met Pope Pius IX. He actually visited me and blessed one of my works. So yes, I entered Oberlin, which was one of the first schools in the country to admit women and people of color.
But things were not perfect.
Far from it. My female classmates and I, black or white, rarely ever was invited to speak in class.
And you were one of just 30 students of color.
On a campus of 1,000 students, and not a single day went by when they did not remind me of that, and not in a nice way.
Something terrible happened there.
Too awful to talk about. You tell them.
It was winter of 1862. Edmonia and 2 white female classmates had plans to go sleigh riding with some young men later that day. Edmonia served her friends some spiced wine, and they became horribly ill, to the point where their lives were repeatedly in danger. Although no evidence was ever found, the townspeople of Oberlin believed that Edmonia had poisoned them. She was formally charged of the crime.
And they tried to kill me.
Yes. Edmonia was dragged into a field one night and savagely beaten, stripped of her clothes, and left for dead. Fortunately, her disappearance was noticed quickly, and the townspeople started a community-wide search, and Edmonia was found and given medical care.
I have very little memory of that. I just remember my painful recovery and the trial.
Edmonia was able to secure a lawyer who was also an alumnus of Oberlin and its 5th Black graduate.
Yes, his name was John Mercer Langston, and God bless him.
After a 6-day trial and a 6-hour closing argument by Mr. Langston,
I won the case. My friends and supporters carried me out of the courtroom. It was a nice moment.
But Oberlin did not have a happy ending.
No, almost a year to the day of my trial, I was accused of stealing art supplies from a professor. Long story short, I never graduated.
But fortunately, Edmonia's abolitionist supporters believed in her despite the bad things that happened at Oberlin.
They wasted no time helping me get to Boston, where I studied with the sculptor Edward Brackett.
I want to pause and explain that Edmonia Lewis, although she had never been a slave herself, was something of a poster child for the abolitionists. She was a popular topic for their nationally circulated publications. The art historian, Kirsten Pye Buick, has explained that while abolitionists fought for freedom for enslaved Black people, their interest was nevertheless to continue to oversee them, as it was widely believed that the whites were a more mature race of people. For this reason, Edmonia Lewis had a sometimes strained relationship with her supporters.
I appreciated them very much, but they often looked down on my intelligence and my abilities.
This is probably why, after Edmonia's first financial windfall,
I sold 100 plaster casts of the sculpture of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw for $15 a piece.
She moved to Italy and established a studio there.
Wow, finally, a picture in color.
In Rome, Edmonia found the freedom to create her art on her own terms. In the same New York Times article quoted earlier, she stated,
I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain opportunities for art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my skin color.
Her work began to express themes that were more personal to her, such as old Indian arrow maker and his daughter, which, along with honoring her Ojibwe heritage, illustrates an excerpt from the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, Song of Hiawatha.
I love that poem. Longfellow's not a bad guy either. I met him once.
Honoring her African American heritage, she created the sculpture Forever Free in 1867.
Yes, showing a strong Black man. Other Black freedom sculptures of that time still had Black folks in subservient positions, like this one.
Yes. So, some scholars regarding Forever Free argue that whether the man's hand on the woman's shoulder is protective or authoritarian. Some have observed that her subservient position was possibly a commentary on the continued struggles of African American women. The woman's position is similar to that on an 1838 coin that combined the sentiments of the women's rights movements and the anti-slavery movements.
Am I not a woman and a sister? Speaking of women who fell upon hard times, what about Cleopatra?
Oh, yes. One of Edmonia's most famous sculptures, which had adventures of its own in the years after Edmonia's death.
Hey!
Oh, sorry. Sometimes spirits forget they're not actually among the living.
And sometimes spirits can actually hear you.
Did I say death? I was talking about the death of Cleopatra. So, Edmonia Lewis created this work and sent it to Philadelphia to be displayed in the 1876 American Centennial Exhibition, a huge event that was also the first World's Fair held in the United States.
After that, the death of Cleopatra was displayed in Chicago in 1878.
After that, the story gets murky.
I was unable to sell the piece.
So, it stayed in Chicago. It stayed in a saloon and then was purchased by a gambler called Blind John Condon, who used it to mark the grave of his beloved racehorse whose name was...
Cleopatra?
Yeah.
Oh.
After Blind John Condon died, the statue was moved to an outdoor construction storage yard where it remained for many years until it was discovered by a Boy Scout troop in 1988 who tried to repair it with house paint.
I do not want to be hearing this.
It finally made its way to the Smithsonian where it was properly restored and is on display today.
Oh, thank goodness.
So not much is known about Edmonia's last years, despite continued prestigious commissions, including one from former President Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes, he sat for me as a model, and I sculpted his portrait. He was quite pleased with the result.
Her neoclassical style of sculpture nevertheless fell out of fashion. She eventually left Rome and moved to England, where her unmarked grave was only discovered in 2015. Thanks to a GoFundMe campaign, the grave has been cleaned up and there is now a plaque honoring Edmonia Lewis. We will start to wrap up with what Kirsten Pye Buick said in the conclusion of her book on Lewis. Her sojourn in Rome represented an escape from the constraints of race and sex, an escape from American prejudice,
and an opportunity that few women, especially women of color, could enjoy.
As she slowly disappeared from the correspondence of her Boston acquaintances and from the circle of her fellow expatriates in Rome,
one can only suppose that Mary Edmonia Lewis had been busy creating her own community elsewhere.
Before we conclude, I'd like to point out one additional honor bestowed on Edmonia just a few short months ago, in January of 2022.
A U.S. postage stamp? Wow.
Congratulations. And thank you.